So where we left off with the previous video, I mentioned that I quickly wanted to show you the difference between a render without meshing and with the meshing enabled. And what we're looking at here is the splash without meshing enabled. If you look at the render time, it took a minute to render, and that's fine, and it gives us a nice preview, if you like, of what the splash is going to be like. Now once you enable meshing, this is the difference. And as you can see, there are a lot more elements now to the actual splash. It's a lot denser. It almost feels a lot more solid as well, like a proper fluid simulation. But the trade-off is down here. It took over 13 minutes just to render this one frame. And this, you have to bear in mind as well, it looks pretty dark because we have some basic lighting in here. We don't have final gather or global illumination or anything like that adding to the render time. So this is just a basic render. But from this, hopefully you can see that meshing is something that you put on later on, maybe towards when you're approaching your final render, or you need to do the really final tweaks before you do your render. But for everything else, leave meshing off, and this just gives you a nice quick preview of how the splash is going to look. If I flip between the two, you can just see the one with meshing looks a whole lot better than the other one. So that's just a quick recap on that. So let's close this down. So you'll notice a few things different with this particular scene. So meshing is enabled on the splash, which is fine. But you'll notice I'm starting at frame 490 and ending at frame 522. Now this is because if we go back to our actual rain simulation, and just to speed things up again, I'm just going to go in. I'm going to turn off meshing because we may be running through a few calculations. So let's go back to my layer editor. So we'll turn the rain back on, and even though we're at frame 525, there's nothing going on here because it hasn't been calculated. We've got the hair there still. So what we want to do is, well, let's just go back to why we're at such a frame rate. Basically, the rain starts at frame 0, and as it starts there's only a few raindrops, but we want this to be a heavier downpour, so we want there to be a build-up of these particles. Let's just set this back to frame 0. So basically, all this time up to here, we're building up that rain and building up all those particles in the background, which are going to help add to the density of the rain in the scene. And again, before what we looked at previously with our Bifrost liquid, you can go in and specify the start time. So in this case, as you can see here marked in green, the start frame is 490. So we're going to calculate all the rain, then start calculating the Bifrost, and then we'll hit our render frame and we'll have everything in place. Now, obviously, we don't want to be going through and calculating 525 frames every time we want to change something. So let's say we're at a stage with the rain where we've tweaked all our values and we're happy with where it is. What we're going to do now is we're going to cache the rain simulation onto the hard drive, so then it's baked in. We can scrub through the timeliner and it's reading it from a file rather than having to calculate it each time. So let's close these down. Let's go back to our layer editor, and I'm just going to hide the Bifrost for now. Going to our rain elements, and I'm going to select the particle 1 and particle 2. Now if you remember, if I just rewind this and play, turn off use default material. There we go, that's better. If we play this, There's that sneaky foot for the Bifrost. Particle 1, if you remember, the particles that are falling. Particle 2 are the ones that are actually bouncing off the floor and bouncing off her body. So we'll select Particle 1 and Particle 2. We'll go to our N-Dynamics menu, go to N-Cache, create new N-Cache. Open up this here, specify a folder, specify a cache name. We'll just leave it like that for now. The start and end time, we'll just let it flood through go through the whole time slider, because we want it to run right up to frame 525, which is the frame that we want to render on. We want to evaluate every frame, and let's just save to one file rather than one file per frame. So all we do now is we click apply, and that will go through, basically calculate each particle and store it to the hard drive. So we'll just let that run through. I'll just pause the video while it gets to the end. So that's finished now, and as you can see, we can nicely scrub through the file, and this is all being read off disk and not actually being calculated, so that's going to speed things up a hell of a lot more for us. And we can save this file out now, and it'll always refer, as you can see down here, it's going to refer to this particle XML file. This also gives you the opportunity to scrub through and think, well, is there a better frame for me to use? Is there something which is a bit more suitable for this particular render? But I think our 525 will be fine. So that's the rain cached, so let's close that down. So now we need to do the same with Bifrost and store that on the hard drive. So again, we can scrub through, and what it also means is the particles are locked in. So if we do a render, we can also save out the cache file, put it on another machine, load in the cache file, and you'll know that between the two machines, in this case the rain and also the Bifrost puddle splash, are all going to be the same. So let's hide the rain for now. Let's bring back our Bifrost simulation, and I'm going to switch to 490, which is where I set the liquid to start to evaluate from. If we look, check in here, start frame 490. Now the green there, that's already been cached to the scratch. That's the scratch cache. So that's the temporary cache. So what we're going to do now is go up to Bifrost, compute and cache to disk, and again it's going to ask in the same way where you want to store it and what the name's going to be. So now let's click create. Now this is a problem that I had before, and I was kind of hoping to leave this in just in case you come up with a similar problem. What we can see here is there's a blue marker here and a red marker here. Now what's happened is basically the Bifrost caching has failed, so it's not worked. So let's go back here, and you see we've got scratch cache on and disk cache on. So let's turn the disk cache back off. Now the way I got around this before is I found that it was because the particles were in the same scene for the rain with the cache and also the hair, and for some reason all of those in the same scene caused the Bifrost cache to crash. Now an easy way would be is what we'll do is we're going to save this file out and then delete all the other cached elements and particle elements in the scene, and then we'll see if that works. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly save this, and then we'll come back in a second and we'll go through that process. And you know, just in case it's a problem you come up with as well, it's just a way around it. So I'll just pause the video for a second. So I've just saved this out as a temporary name. So what it means is I can load it back in, and then we can point the cache file for the Bifrost to the cache once it's been baked. So nhair is going to go, the rain is going to go. I'm just going to do optimize scene size just to clean out anything else that's in there. Just double check. So now let's see if we can run this again. Exactly the same way as we did before. Let's click create. And there we can start to see this is building up these blue frames. And these, when it's blue, it indicates that it's reading that, well, basically it's reading off the disk, so it's a cache file. So we'll just let this run through. Actually, I'll pause it again. So those are now cached to the disk. As you can see, this is all blue, but we've still lost our rain and our hair, which we had to strip out. But before we do that, I'm just going to go into the attribute editor. Let's scroll down. Where is it? There we go. Under the liquid container, under caching, now we can see here, this is where the directory is for the cache file, and that is the name for it. Now we can also browse to this as well. So I'm just going to load in the file that we saved out previously. So that's loaded in. Now let's go back to, and we'll notice we've still got our rain in this scene. I'll just bring that back so we can see it. Make that visible. So that's still reading off that cache file, which is fine. Go to our Bifrost liquid, attribute editor, enable disk cache. And if we remember, the path was, I mean, you can just click here and browse to it, but I just remember that it was in 06. Okay, maybe we browse to it instead. Let's just load in one. So there, it's gone blue, so we know that that's loaded in. If we go to 490, see, we can just scrub through now, and it's reading off the disk. Let's just go back here, and we're just going to turn off the scratch disk. Okay, Bifrost options, disable background processing, and disable the scratch cache. Close. So that's now off now, so there won't be any. This is purely reading it off the disk. There won't be anything read or calculated. And as you can see, we can scrub through this. Yes, it's a little bit slower because obviously it's calculating all those particles. So there we have we have all the rain in the scene. We have a huge splash. I mean, we could now go back and say, well, maybe that's a bit too big. Maybe we go back to frame 520. Now, one thing to note is if you change any values on the liquid or any values on the particles for the rain, you will need to redo the cache. Otherwise it won't update. So just keep that in mind. So now let's go back. Let's turn on our Bifrost meshing. Just let that update. Is that done? Yep. Now you can see there it's blue because we've got viewport 2.0 on. I switch to default material. There we can see the meshing a little bit better. Turn that off. So there we've got rain, we've got the splash. We've also got these particles in the scene, so we could go in like so Let's move this over. Now remember, when we were going to render, we were going to turn up the overall render quality just for a nicer quality render. But if we go down to particle display, we can now start to play around with the actual particles a little bit. We can adjust the point size to make those a bit more noticeable. So we can maybe double those, or go a little bit more, just to make that bit of spray a bit more noticeable. So let's go back to our main camera view. Close this down. Let's load in the, where's the layer editor? Hiding down here. Let's bring her hair back. So let's go to our render view. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to let this render just this view here. And we'll just see what it's all looking like. Set the test resolution, that's quite small. Render, main camera. What I'll do is I'll leave this to render. As you saw previously, with meshing on, it will take a while. But we'll come back shortly and just have a look at the render and just see how things are going on before we wrap up the tutorial. So click on that, set that going.